потрібно. Про закінчення цієї війни потрібно. Але зараз доля країни повністю залежить від нашої армії.
We've all heard the conventional narrative, but in this video, I'm going to show you how things might not be as they seem. To many, the Russia-Ukraine war seems like a story of heroic Ukrainian resilience in the face of overwhelming Russian military aggression. And this is true, but it only gives us part of the picture. I'm going to show you how the media have systematically misinformed the public about the nature of the war, and what unveiling the other half of the story reveals about why the conflict persists and how it can end. You see, unlike Britain in World War I or II, Ukrainians aren't manufacturing their weapons, even to a limited extent. On top of this, their economy has been devastated by millions of women and children fleeing to neighbouring countries, their agricultural heartlands being seized, along with the ports that form the lifeblood of a Ukrainian export basis. All in all, GDP has declined by over 30%, even given all the aid. So how are they fighting, you might ask? The Americans. Since the beginning, the US military have been fundamental to the Ukrainian war effort. Listening to the British PM or the German Chancellor, you might get the impression that the war effort is some sort of pan-European alliance against Russian aggression. But the stats belie a very different story. The US dollar simply counts more than any of the other countries combined. This isn't a story of the West united to help Ukrainian resistance. The war is being exclusively funded by the Americans. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with the war itself? Aren't you kind of getting away from the point? And isn't it the fundamental right of the Ukrainian people to defend itself from Russian aggression? And if this is being facilitated by friendly nations, who cares what countries are involved and the extent of their involvement? What matters is that Ukrainians are getting the weapons they need to fight the oppression they're suffering. But I'll counter that fundamentally, in a world where countries operated not for their own interests but for the greater good, in heroic defense of democracy, then that would be a legitimate argument. But in the modern world of great power politics, countries align themselves with others for their own perceived interests. And the balance of power in those alliances can have a fundamental effect on the nature of the conflict. In the American case, they don't care about Ukrainians. They didn't care about Ukrainians before, they don't care about Ukrainians now. What they care about is maintaining their hegemony. And these interests have entered the wartime calculus in such a way that the nature of the conflict has fundamentally changed. To understand this, we need to head over the sunny Middle Eastern paradise of Israel. You see, we all know the narrative, the mainstream one, pushed by the Americans and the media broadly in the West, that the war is continuing to escalate because of the Russians' intransigence in the face of Ukrainian resistance. Putin is purely an unreasonable tyrant who wants to invade Kiev, take over the whole of Ukraine, and dominate all of Europe afterwards, to form the neo-Soviet empire. But the former Israeli PM paints a very different picture. He says that when he travelled to Moscow as an intermediary for negotiations last March, both Russia and Ukraine were very receptive and willing to make compromises, to at the very least enter into a ceasefire. What interrupted this? It was not Putin that caused this to end, or even the determination of the Ukrainian people. It was Biden. Why did this happen? Well, in his own words, Russia and Ukraine want a ceasefire and have drawn about 17 or 18 ceasefire drafts, but at some point the West decided to crush Putin rather than to negotiate. This account suggests that it's not as simple as a conflict between oppressors and the oppressed, or even a genocidal war to end Ukrainian identity itself. Rather, whether a peace is achieved or the war continues to drag on is highly dependent not on the Ukrainians, but on US foreign policy interests. So to understand the conflict, we have to go beyond Ukraine, to the heart of the US military-industrial complex? And what can the logic that underlies this tell us about the true nature of the war in Ukraine and what we need to do to put it to an end? Well, it's complicated. The US is not dominated by any one interest, party, or ideology, and thus convergence results from a broad alliance of different parties. Part of the story is money, of course. The military-industrial complex has an extreme impact not only on US GDP, research, but on the political establishment. Defense dollars flood the Senate, and senators may be known for their greed, for their avarice, for their perversion, but one thing we can be sure of is they'll never turn down money. You see, after Iraq and Afghanistan imploding, the military kind of ran out the excuses for continuous dramatic increases in military spending kind of dried up. The left and the right were moving towards an implicit agreement that spending had got out of control and some sort of compromise should be reached. What did Ukraine do? It changed this calculus fundamentally, giving the military-industrial complex a means by which to lobby for increased spending in the name of preventing Russian aggression. But the story isn't just money. You see, as with Iraq, moneyed interests were allied with neocon foreign policy hawks, whom were hyper-focused on great power competition with Russia. The Russians were seen to have been spreading their influence across the Middle East, Central Asia, at the expense of perceived US interests. Both the US and Russia have a long history of utilizing proxy military battles to further their strategic goals. Whether it's Russian involvement in Vietnam or US funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, plenty of precedent exists for us to reasonably infer that US officials see the merit in grinding down the Russians, even if they are fully aware of the virtual impossibility of a meaningful Ukrainian victory and Russian internal collapse. And therefore, to see this war end is not simply a matter of giving Ukrainians more weapons, or sanctioning the Russians more, or killing Putin, or calling for his arrest. We need to force the US to come to the table